Live on Twitch. Let's see what we can find out. Right, I should be able to see the chat. Yep, there's someone called Battle Monkey. Fantastic. And yeah, I'm also in the.
Hey Steve, it's Ryan.
Hey, are you Battle Monkey?
Yeah, I'm Battle Monkey.
Okay.
And I now set you up on stream as well, or on Twitch.
Cool.
I just didn't realize to come look for you in the.
That's right. I'm just gonna look around in some of these other groups and stuff. But yeah, we can do this again another time. When was the last post on here? The last post on here was 7:14. Then you 7:34. I see one person is on. I think everyone, maybe everyone went away for dinner or something, or they. Yeah, I don't know. I said 8 to some people, but then I said I'll be there from 7:30 to sort of prep, so people might come at 8.
Okay. I thought maybe there was some type of content or theory kind of stuff that you wanted to cover before.
That was also the plan, yeah, to do questions and answer questions, and yes, give us time to sort of do a bit of that. It looks like everyone has kind of logged off. I'm just checking some of the other groups.
I'm not sure if they'll do anything. They've been the organizers of the ParkerCon helped us did a little shout out to tell they were doing for in their Arc News channel.
They put me in. They scheduled it. They put it in the promo thing. But you don't know. It was really late notice. They've been organizing it for a while, but they didn't tell anyone that it was happening. Except then they went and everyone, they'd already sort of sorted out all their speakers, so there wasn't a lot of room. And they were like, "No, we can't fit you in, so we'll just mention you." That's all right. I was just trying to help out. I was originally just going to do a speech as well. I was also going to offer to do a talk, but that didn't happen. So, all right. I tell you what, I will. I'll leave this running, and I'll go make a cup of tea, and I'll see if anyone shows up, and then otherwise, well, it is Tabletop Tuesday this week, so maybe we can do something at Tabletop Tuesday if other people want to learn.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be there again on Tuesday. I know last month there was talk about doing a live, I think, podcast recording, but I'm not sure if you guys I didn't see anybody doing that. So,
yep. All right. I will go make a cup of tea. If you see anyone, tell them to stick around.
Okay, we'll do.
And a back.
I don't know if it shows any. I think it's just the one. I think it's just me. I don't think it shows anybody else.
All right. Well, yeah. If you want to ask me any questions, man, and we can talk some more about this on Tuesday. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess from my perspective, I was just like I haven't really done a lot with like role playing games.
Yeah.
Last time I was kind of involved with one was probably like 20 or 30 years ago, back as a teenager.
Yeah.
And so I've got a little bit of experience from that. I was, from memory, I think it was what was that? It was a vampire themed one.
Masquerade? Vampire the Masquerade?
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. I think there was a parallel card game that had
yeah, it was called The Eternal Struggle.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. Anyway, so I don't really have a lot of reference points for RPGs.
Yeah.
But I don't know, when you posted about it, I just thought it was something to kind of check out. And since it was a short game jam, I figured like I'd either try to do something or I'd just at least see what other things were happening in this kind of space.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I saw that you were going to do your little how to do a quick one or workshop on it, I thought that would be a good fit. So I guess I say all that as just context to say like it'd be interesting just to kind of maybe get a little bit of an introduction about like how you think about designing an RPG, and what actually goes into one, because it could be like the idea of trying to put together like a giant book is probably not the goal, but I'm not sure, what some of the components are that people think about when they talk about creating one.
Yeah. So look, I've actually done. There's a few talks on my YouTube channel about how to get started, and one of the reasons I ran this whole thing is that it's very easy to try, as you say, to make that giant book. And I'm just going to see if I can put this in the chat. This is a link to what the RPGs in an Hour, which has a system that we kind of use. And the reason, as I say, the reason we're doing this is that it's very difficult to finish something if you start something that's going to be 300 pages. The first RPGs I started working on were just way too big, and then I picked something really small and I was able to finish that. And that's really helpful to go through every step of being in an RPG, of making an RPG and finishing it and then showing it to other people and testing it and playing it. And just like with all game design, the faster that you can get to those aspects, the better. And a lot of what I do when I'm mentoring and teaching is helping people go, you need to be able to test this and you need to get it in front of people. And yeah, look, a lot of the design of an RPG is really helping people get, like, if you write a giant book, you have to have a system to get people to play it. And that is also part of your job. So you have to get good at explaining things and teaching people things. And that's something that only comes from testing as well. So you need to, if you lock yourself in your room and just try to build a huge book, you're not going to be able to build a book that people can navigate. So what we do with the RPG in an Hour is we try to show the building blocks of an RPG. And really for me, that comes down to, I always focus on what are people doing around the table? Why are they there? What do they get out of role-playing games? And if you keep it to a fairly narrow definition, like there's a lot of people playing around with the edges of how you do this, but basically for most of the standard definitions, that's anything vaguely like D&D. You've got a bunch of people playing individual characters who are telling a story. You've got I've got this little summary. There's characters who are telling a story. They're distinct from each other. They affect the environment that they're in, causing things to change, and they'll often have to risk or lose something as part of that, and go through a cycle of going out, seeking danger, and then recovering from that in some way. And that works that's a nice broad definition. So what we do is we focus on really that first part of like, what is our setting? Because that's really important. So the first part of the design is getting a good idea of a setting that involves groups of people going out, doing things, and the people who are distinct and taking risks and causing change and things like that. You can't start with a setting that doesn't have a way for groups of people to go on missions. So the first part is we gather ideas, and I use a couple of different methods to just get ideas, and then we go, okay, how do we shape that into a setting that has different kinds of characters doing things? Then I get people to just come up with their own character. Like we work until we know the setting and can sum it up nice and succinctly, because that's part of that showing people what you want them to do. Like, as I say, that you've got to get them to the game. So we try to sum it up as nice as we can. And we go, okay, now that's the setting. We know the basic things. Who would you play in that game? And what we do from that is generate all the kind of levers that we might have. So that's, so if a lot of people want to be, different types of supernatural monsters, if that's coming up in the setting, then that might be one of the what we call the splats or the classes or something like that, the archetypes, the playbooks. You're looking for aspects that sort of, if everyone sort of says, oh, I want to be a different kind of profession, then profession is going to be a stat and things like that, so that you can create lists of distinct elements. Because that's really important. The reason that the things come back to classes and things like that, and archetypes and splats and groups and factions, is because it's giving someone a way to be unique in the group. It does look like someone else is here according to this, but I can't see them.
I see there's a couple other people who seem to have joined the Twitch stream, it looks like. So.
Fantastic. If you're here, please wave, because we don't know if we're doing this. So we don't have enough people. It's not worth doing. But yes, so we
One
work.
thing that'd be interesting for me, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah.
But I feel like when I think about play testing a board game, or even by comparison on the other far side of things, like a video game even.
Yeah.
I feel like play testing makes a lot more sense and is more straightforward about being able to figure out both mechanically what doesn't work, as well as some of the, I guess, the emotions and broader experience that you're trying to generate does or doesn't work. How do you, what is the thought process when you're trying to play test an RPG, considering that the people are kind of have this kind of like open space to kind of do whatever they want in an RPG? How do you kind of figure out if they're just, this isn't the right way to frame this, but it's like, are they just like doing a bad job of playing, or is something broken in the game kind of thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable question. I always like to I encourage everyone to who designs RPGs to design other kinds of games, because I think it's too easy to sort of think that RPGs are special and that there aren't mechanics that drive play. But there is certainly a lot of people who play role-playing games in a very free-form way, in a way that is sort of not really using the mechanics, but they're still using the setting. So part of playtesting is actually what I just said there. It's like, if this is the setting, what characters would you make? And if people don't know, you haven't done the setting properly. So a lot of the testing isn't just, is more about testing ideas as opposed to testing mechanics, or as well as testing mechanics. So you're looking at, does this setting inspire people? Do they want to make up good characters? What do those characters want to do? And so a lot of what we do in what you're doing in a design is actually sometimes just going to people like, hey, if this was the campaign, would you play? who would you want to be, and that's part of the playtesting, is testing the ideas. But there is very much like playtesting game mechanics, is you're watching people's emotions. It depends a lot on the kind of system. So the complexity level, obviously, if it's a fairly complex system, you ensure that the mechanics as you've chosen them are balanced and are producing the results you want. Someone doesn't pick up a gun and just completely dominate, or unless that's what you want. So you can test those kind of things. So when we were testing relics, for example, we were really key to get certain aspects out of the cards and out of the powers and something. You can post questions in the Discord. You can post questions on the Twitch. And I cannot remember what it was, but there was just something. I sat and watched a game for 4 hours, and I was just counting how many times certain things happened, and they just weren't happening enough. They weren't triggering enough of some of the angelic powers. So I went, okay, we have to change that. Look, there's a lot of playtesting, but you do need to have some awareness of, yes, as you say, what the GM is doing, what the group is doing. Some GMs are going to run things quite differently, but I think the idea that you can go anywhere and do anything is it's not where the RPG works. Like, you're still going to go into a dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons, right? You're still going to fight a dragon. So you need to see if, do people want to go in there? Do they feel like they should? Can they fight the dragon? Or is the dragon just crushing them? Have they made the kind of characters that would appear in that story, and so on?
Do you think it's better to have particularly in the early phases of the RPG development or the design, is it better to have an inexperienced GM or a very experienced GM to do the playtesting with?
I think
a more experienced GM would potentially obfuscate or be able to kind of cover up gaps or holes that you might have in a better way to make the play smoother, but that might not be what you want.
Yeah. You're dead right in that. Role-playing games are funny because a lot of them a lot of people play them the way they think they should be played, not the way they're written in the game, in the rules. And so in that case, having someone who's never played a role-playing game before can be really useful, because the GM is just going to sort of ignore some of those things that you've written down and just go, well, I know how to play an RPG. And I think that's really important. And players too. If you're GMing yourself, players might be making assumptions, and that can be really challenging in the design. To go, I actually want to change how you might play, especially if you're changing something key. Now, the score, for example, has really strict rules about who talks at a certain time, and some people hit that like a wall. They're like, wait, I'm the loud player. But then he was like, one of the players who was like a loud player was like, oh, this is actually really good. No one's going to hate me now because I can't talk over anyone. So that was an example of something where I had to be aware of that as a tester, to go, as I'm demoing this, first of all, are people respecting it? But also, I've made it really clear in the rule. Are my playtesters, my demo is picking up on that? There's only so much you can do with some of this, but people are just going to go, well, I'm playing it how I want to. But it is definitely a case that you have to be careful with the assumptions people are making. On the other hand, a lot of RPGs are very, very similar. Back in the day, I was in a competition called Game Chef, and we had to make our RPGs had to be 3,000 words at the most or something. And I had a reviewer pick me up for like, well, how do people set up scenes or something? And I'm like, I didn't have room to say, just play it like D&D, where the GM says what's going on and you react and he reacts to you. Because I just ran out of word count, and it's perfectly fine to sort of assume some of those things, or sum them up quickly. Like, This isn't your first RPG. Go play D&D.
So maybe for as a newbie myself, how would you distinguish? Is it worth making some sort of a distinction between an underlying game engine or game system for an RPG that maybe you can reuse? I don't know if maybe there's a parallel to using something like Unity in a game development context or a video game context, and similarly, like I guess or when you contrast the game system versus like a campaign or a mechanic that you're adding to that, how do you make that distinction?
Yeah, again, that's an astute comparison. Certainly, if you want to stick to a fairly traditional mode where you create a story as a GM and players sort of interact with the environment, then a lot of people use existing settings. And that's one of the reasons why D&D has been so successful, because they've had different models of the open gaming license where people can actually publish things. Powered by there's a game called Apocalypse World, which put its system into the open source, and there's millions of games based on that because it has provided a lingua franca. Most people have played one of the games, so you get this connecting effect. We got someone else has joined us. Please ask questions if you like. We're just talking about how to make your first role-playing games and what role-playings are built out of. So your role when we do the RPG in an hour, I say let's borrow and modify an existing system, because that's a great way to get started. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to figure out, what kind of things do we need in our system, right? Well, if we're going to be most RPGs are what we call task resolution to some extent. So I'm a player. My player is creating an avatar that exists in the physical imaginal world, and he wants to do something. How does that task resolve? And you just pretty much 99% of all RPG systems are based on that idea. How does the scene play out if you want to be even more expansive? And so you can just look at something you played and go, well, that was about... So Dungeons and Dragons, you look at your skill, you look at your stat, you roll a d20. If you get the difficulty number, you succeed. Now you can make up your own stat plus skill plus roll plus difficulty number, but you might as well just copy d20s if you're just going for that sort of thing, or something very near it, because most systems aren't very far away. And then a lot of what is sort of on top of an RPG are the wrinkles of how those things are expressed, how they're actually supposed to be played, what kind of skills you have. Like often it's really not the dice roll. I mean, the dice roll can matter, but it's more about those things I mentioned earlier that guide you to who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing. And that's often done by the words you use and the stats that you have. If you've got a space on your character sheet to put your list of weapons and your armor, you're going to think I should be fighting, right? If you build a character sheet that doesn't have space for anything of that and has a space to write down all your friends and their birth dates, then you're going to be like, oh, well, maybe I should be planning a party because it's Bob's birthday tomorrow. So a lot of and both of those systems could easily use the same D20 to just go, do you plan the party successfully? Do you hit the dragon? But it's that infrastructure on the character sheet and the words and the setting that's making you make choices as a player. So there's definitely a sort of, there's different kinds of things. When we talk about system, we can mean almost anything in the game. Like I often say that everything in a game is a mechanic. And that's true whether it's RPGs or tabletop games. That goes all the way to the art, to the front cover, even to the layout of the front cover, all the way through how the rule book is laid out, the art. Everything is actually a thing that drives play. And if you have the wrong art for the wrong mechanics, it'll create discord, and people will be like, well, this isn't the game I thought I was going to be playing, or I don't understand this mechanic because it's got the wrong picture. An amazing example of that in Magic the Gathering, where they had a card that worked like the Trojan horse, and basically you played it into your opponent's play area. So they got this fantastic creature, and then on the next turn, you started producing all these 1/1 warriors just out of nowhere. As long as they controlled the horse. And then during playtesting, they were like, the fantasy setting that we're in doesn't really care about horses. Everything is about lions. We're all the lion guard. So they changed it to this Athelian lion, and nobody knew how to play it. People were like, why would I give my opponent this character? Like, it's giving them a monster. It doesn't help me. And that was just because it didn't have the horse on it anymore. So people didn't know how to use it. So setting information is a mechanic in that sense. It guides test. If anyone, new people, please put questions into the chat. We probably aren't going to do a build an RPG because we haven't got a huge amount of folks, unless we get more in the time being.
So maybe, I don't know if this is if we don't end up doing the RPG in an hour.
Yep.
I don't know if other people might find this useful, but I happened to see your entry into the game jam.
Yes.
And, obviously, it stuck out to me as quite short, and I'm sure that's probably by design for you.
Yes.
I wonder if it might be useful, or if you're willing to, because it's obviously an entry, just to kind of go through what you've written and kind of like pull out some of the different elements that are there, and show how such a short piece of text is actually a complete definition of an RPG. Because like, there's obviously a lot of stuff that is either assumed in this, or maybe I don't see some of the details there, but it might be useful for other people to understand how this constitutes the minimum requirements, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is definitely something that I do that not every other game designer does. I've become known as being a speed designer and a short designer. I've put RPGs in tweets. For me, like, I wouldn't necessarily put this in front of a beginner, but an RPG really just needs a way to explain the setting. And that's something that, again, I do a lot of shorthand on, and not everyone else is not every player in the world is gonna click on that. They'll be like, wait, where are we? But if you look at a lot of my games, they're very much, yes, just like the score is all, we're pulling a heist in the modern world. That's it. That's the whole setting. And then you generate some cards to pick. So this one, all I say is that, so we had to make a game that is sort of about, that, and I was like, right, well, I want to have a story between these 4 colors. And I immediately thought of Avatar. So I was like, one time, for centuries, the 4 nations lived in peace, and then the Red Nation attacked. That is a very simple summary of a setting. If you've heard of Avatar, you immediately get a lot of ideas. Even if you haven't, it's got a lot of suggestiveness in it. There are these universes; they existed in peace. The Red Nation is attacking the others. That's a lot to give you a plot hook. This game, which I put the link to, is very much like a lot of my partners in the score, where instead of having an avatar necessarily controlling it, you're not sort of saying, I'm Eric the Cleric, and as Eric the Cleric, I want to go into the dungeon. You're more playing a card and going, okay, that is a trigger that says I'm encountering this element of the story. And then the play is actually more about you taking on the GM and going, okay, so if I'm in the green world and I played a 2, then that means the story is going to be about, in this scene, is going to be this event. And that's not how most people consider an RPG. So, in fact, I'd say, if you play a 2 of green, then you're in the green world, and it's a scene about love or friendship. And you're like, well, what's my character? Well, you've got some characters down the bottom you can choose. So we might have an artist. Now, there's very little structure there.
Sorry to interrupt you,
Yep.
Steve. I'm just for the other people that are on the stream. If it's helpful, maybe we can do just a screen share of your thing online.
That makes sense. Yep.
Otherwise, I've got it up. If you're able to stream, I can share my screen to the Discord. If you can then put that up on your.
Yes, that'll work. Yep. Actually, there we go. I should be able to. I have it there. Can you see that now, guys? So it's called Universal Nation Overture because that spells Yeah,
it's just not coming up now. Yeah, that's there you go.
So the score and partners work with this what I call what is called a prompt game. So instead of me wondering what my character Eric the Cleric wants to do, we generate a prompt for a scene. Now, really cut this to the bare bone in this, but you could get right. We're in the green world and we're having a scene about love and friendship. I'm playing an artist, so I'm actually going to be painting a picture for my best friend, which is maybe this other player. That's it, and that's the whole bit. Now, some people would say that's not a role-playing game because I'm not really embodying my character, and that's fair. That's their definition. But you can also make quite short games that do use that model, and I will actually go and find one. I'm just going to stop sharing that. Actually, I'll leave that up, but I will go and no, it won't let me. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that for a sec, and I'm going to go and find one of my other RPGs, which fits in a tweet, and that actually has a more sort of standard idea of play, but still fits in a very small amount of space.
Okay.
So just give me one sec.
So I guess I'll let you bring up your other one.
Yeah.
Right? As I read this and hearing how you're describing the framework, if you will, that first sentence there, for centuries, the four realities lived in harmony. That is kind of it's kind of the full encapsulation of the setting.
Yep.
And obviously people then have to imagine all of the other details that might come off of that.
That's right.
And then the second sentence there, then the Red Nation attacked. I don't know a lot about this, but I've seen it described in other places. I think that you would describe that as the inciting incident.
Yep.
Is that
Yep.
would describe that?
Yeah. So it's still part of the setting, really. It's driving. It's something that drives action in the setting, and is pushing the setting a little bit, which you want. You want your setting to be. Let's see. Does that have an app? Yeah.
Was that like the event or the scenario that sits within the setting kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like,
so I'm actually writing a big series about why can't you load that post, you silly thing? Open the post. Look at the post. Okay, let me just reload for a second. Surely if you click on a thing, it comes up. Yes, it does. Right, good. Oh, actually, hang on. Yeah, where's Snicked? Here we go. Here is another RPG. Let me just share my screen again. Right, so this is a role-playing game about being a Marvel hero. We were joking about how Marvel, particularly in the 90s, have certain kind of qualities, and also the idea of seeing if you can make a acronym as your stats, and that's based on an old Marvel RPG called Phase Rip, which is what the setting is. The system is called Phase Rip because it's fighting, agility, strength, endurance, whatever the R stands for, intelligence, and I think it's poise or presence or something. Maybe it's power. so we were playing around with that, and I was like, okay, I have to make one that's snicked because that's what Wolverine's claws say. So this has, it's implying a setting through the use of the word snicked. You've got a system. Roll that many d4s. A 4 is a success. If you roll any ones, add angst and lock out the dice. So that's a very shorthand way of saying that dice you can't use anymore. And then there's a way to heal. So you can reclaim those angst dice if there's a horrifying tragedy that happens according to your terrible burden, which you can do in character gen. And then fight ninjas is really the verb of the setting. Like, what are you doing in the game? You're fighting ninjas. So that's got that. There's a lot of assumptions there. You probably have a GM, but you can see that you've got a bunch of stats. You've got 5 stats which are rated 1 to 5. That effectively gives you 5 by 4 by 3 by 2 builds that you can have, which is 60, I think. No, 120 different builds. You've got a terrible burden, which is like a backstory. So you're able to make a character. Characters need to be distinct. So if I've got a 5 in ninja training, I'm much better at sneaking than Bob, who's got a 3 or a 2 in it. So I feel different. I feel distinct. I've got what we call spotlight time. So that's really important. I've also got something that I can talk about, which is my terrible burden. Now, again, there's a lot of shorthand in here. You have to understand that 90s superhero characters like Spider-Man, he's got that guilt, and Daredevil, he's got that Catholic guilt, and Batman has to save everyone like his parent, like he couldn't save his parents. And then you have that system. As I say, it's about, can you resolve a task? You're rolling a pool of d4s. And that's all you really need for a role-playing game. You do want to have some sort of consequence or ability to change. And whether that's to change the setting or it's to change the characters. But then you've got ways that you can... you want to have ways that things can go up and down. If you're just sitting there going, do I succeed? I'll try again. I'll try again. I'll try again. That's not really interesting. And that's actually something that still existed in D&D. There was no rules about how much you could try something. Technically, back in the early editions, you could just try and pick a lock for as long as you wanted. The only thing that was controlled about that was when they brought in timing rules and wandering monsters. So, without some sort of consequence, things get very loose. But yeah, you can see that game has the building blocks that we talk about. You've got
One of the things that really sticks out to me is there's not, particularly with this idea of like fight ninjas, there's nothing inherently there that says like what the rules are for fighting ninjas, or like, is it just a matter of like, okay, GM says there's 5 ninjas, and then you go fight, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna fight ninja 1 and roll a dice, and GM says pass or fail, or
look.
I mean, that's maybe an oversimplification, but when you have something like this, are you relying on GMs to kind of make things up, or is there more of an assumption of saying, okay, this is based on one of those other systems that we talked about that you can then
this isn't really based on an existing system, but an existing understanding of what an RPG scene is. Okay. So what happens, and you've talked a little bit about this, about campaigns and adventures, and that's definitely another vector, but a lot of GMs don't really like those things, and they like to be a bit more freeform anyway. So if I made up a character in this, I might also have things I want to do already. So I might be driving the narrative as a player. But in a scene, yes, the GM might say there are 5 ninjas around you. You can try to fight them with your kill ability, how hard you can kill people. So everyone roll those dice, and if you roll success count is something that's a terminology. So what you've got here is you can roll one or more 4s. So the GM might be like, oh, he's a really tough ninja. You need 3 successes to hit him, and that means you've got to roll really, really well, or something like that. And a lot of this is on the borderline of barely useful, obviously. because I try to get it into a tweet. But the concept, the building blocks are all there that you need. You just have to have a way to, well, effectively, as I say, all RPGs really come back to a way to set scenes and a way to resolve scenes. And a lot of the setting of the scenes is done by the GM. So, really, when you get your D&D book, right, you get the first book is just things the players can do and how to resolve them. It's just a list of powers, effectively. And then the second book is sort of how to make maps, how to run plots. And then the third book is really all the things that you throw at the players, which are the monsters that make it interesting. And if you can make up your own enemies, or if you have a system that is all just rolled on yourself, like a lot of systems are just the players roll, and if they succeed, they win. If they don't, then the monster hurts them. Then you don't even need the monsters in that case. So, yeah, you effectively, you just have to have things that you can throw at the players. And as you get more experience as a GM and have you more simple systems, you just need stats for the players, really, and whether they succeed or fail. It gets more interesting if you have different ways that you can challenge them. And that's a lot of the reasons why we have more of these books and more, the monster manuals really like lots of things that work slightly differently, which allows for longer term play. And of course, different kinds of characters with different builds allows for longer term play because you can keep making up different characters. But the essence of a scene is, you're in a hole in the ground and a dragon attacks. Roll which your favored weapon or favored spell and see what it does. And you either then get RPGs either provide a story in an adventure scenario, which has a bunch of those encounters strung together by a plot, or they give you effectively a big random chunk of tables, which is what the monster manual is. It's like pick one of these monsters and throw it at them, and then pick another monster and throw it at them. And that's sort of why there's the tables in the Uno game that I made. If we go back to that, that's the monster manual effectively, or the random generation element of I'm not sure what's going to happen. Oops, that's the wrong one. And that's the real. There are three sort of elements in RPGs. There's players making decisions about who they are and what their strengths are and how they're going to use those strengths. There's GMs setting up scenes, and then there's some other element that's giving the GM resources, whether that's a random generation of scenarios, whether it's setting ideas. If you go to the page with the rather 1 hour games on it, that's actually you'll see, like, if we click on. So let's have a look at Inherit.
You've got the GAMES system.
Yep. But if you open, so I'm just clicking on one of them now, and I'm going to change to share it once it comes up. Yes, so let me just share this. So we worked at the top of this is the setting, and then we come into the rules. And as you'll see, a lot of the rules are also communicating settings. So here, there are 6 skills you can take, just like there were 5 in SNCC. You can have sinew, scheme, secrecy, science, schmoozing, and serendipity. And then you can roll a d6. You roll a pool of d6s to get results. We've also set up here you can take a civilian background to give you a bonus. So that gives you a bit of backstory. Again, that gives you flavor, gives you a way to play your character, which is really important. If you just give people stats, they're just like, well, I'm the strong guy. But if you're the strong guy who comes from the Cloud Kingdom, then you can be like, well, in the Cloud Kingdom, we do things differently. And all of a sudden you're role-playing, right? So a hook and thing like that. But at the bottom of this, we actually put in a random table of scenario generation. So instead of giving a GM like here's some monsters or here's some ideas, what we have here is what I like is like roll for who the bad guys are, what the item is, this is a setting about people inheriting great objects, what kind of candidate they are, and what's the complication that's making things harder. And that's another way to sort of do. And then once the GM knows that, like, oh, we're fighting, the deniers, and the item is really world-shakingly powerful, but the candidate is poor and lowly, and then there's the bad guys already have it. Right, I can see a basic storytelling structure. So we start off, with you getting this alert or whatever it is, which will all be communicated by the setting. If we look at something like Future Thieves, for example, that was a one where your whole thing is going back in time, and there's a time clock built into it. If you run out of a certain number of chips, your scenario is over. So that's got a nice structure to it again. You're like, every adventure we know, it begins with us going back in time, or going forward in time, actually, I think it is. Yeah. So there's that structure that the GM knows. Okay, so this is a bit like then the Red Nation attacked, right? You live in the Old West, you found a gateway to 200 years in the future. What's happening about that today? That's your hook. And then you can use that to spell out an adventure. And we have down here, like, instead of having a mystery generator, we put a list of like questions that we hadn't really decided. Because you're in this secret society called the 83s. So are they working who are they? What's their real mission? What do they want from the future? How does the time travel work? Who built it? These are all big questions. And that box is there to make you go, oh, I bet I could make an adventure about that. And that's coming back to really a lot of what an RPG is doing, is making you have ideas as easily as possible.
Okay.
And whether that's an idea of what your character does, or how it's cool, or how it's or what they should do, and that's how I see it anyway. The purpose of the role-playing system is to give everyone at the table as much help as possible to tell a cool story where their character is cool. And everything else is really in service to that. And there are other reasons people play RPGs. People like to just read big books. They like to plan their builds. But in a sense, they're doing the same thing. They're reading to find cool ideas that they want to tell. And they're making these builds so their characters can be cool. So this one...
When I was a kid, I think that was one of the reasons why I... one of the things in retrospect, I think one of the things I didn't do, quote unquote, right, was I approached early versions of trying to figure out an RPG as like, how do I win this?
Yeah.
Like, what's the best character and the best things to like optimize the thing? And in retrospect, that was really the wrong way to think about playing the RPG.
There's nothing wrong with playing. Look, there are plenty of RPGs that basically play that way. At least at some level or some assumption. And so effectively the big book of player guides is here are the tools so you can defeat the GM, and the big book of monsters has the tools so you can make the players suffer. And that's okay. That is a sort of skirmish level miniatures game where you can also make jokes and try to mess with the story. And that's a fine way to play, and there are definitely games like Dungeons & Dragons really is that. As much as it keeps pretending to be a storytelling game, that's what it does well. It does really a skirmish level combat that you can also change the story on. You don't just have to follow the plot exactly. And I gave up on them because I just got tired of the systems not being interesting enough for me. I'd rather play something like Gloomhaven. But what works about most role-playing games in that space is that people like the combination. They want to play. They kind of want to play a tactical war game, but they're worried about not being smart enough, and they kind of want to play a theatrical acting game, but they're worried about not being creative enough. And by combining those, that's where the core of the hobby is for a lot of people. They get a little bit of each and they feel safe. They can always, if they start getting a bit emotionally vulnerable in the acting, they can go back to the combat. If they're feeling like, oh, this is really a grind, can we do some role playing? They can drop out of that. And it's also generally a system that's quite easy. They're not going to sit down and go, I painted all my minis for this fight and the guy crushed me in 10 seconds. And the GM is there to sort of go, and like if they are getting crushed and they don't have the tactical skills, the GM can also pull back a little bit. I don't know if you know Blood on the Clock Tower.
It's been on my list. I'm aware of it, but I haven't played it yet.
Yes, so it's got its DNA in Werewolf and other social deduction games. Do you know those?
Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things it has that's really important is it has a GM role. And that's really vital because the GM controls some of the information release. So if you're sitting there and you're watching just because of how it's sat down, the evil players are all better at thinking and deduction. They're all better liars, and they're crushing the good players. The GM can actually give the good players more powers, more information, using things secretly to nudge them up until they're actually having a more fun game. And that's something that I think we shouldn't just keep into RPGs. Like that's another thing that RPGs makes people feel safe, is that there's a sense that although we're trying to beat the GM, he's also there to give us a good time. And there's a few other board games that have played around with this idea where instead of putting a knife at everyone's throat and going, be the best you possibly can be and the smartest person will win, there are ameliorating factors. I've got an amazing mystery-solving game called Detective City of Angels. And unlike all the detective games that exist are either one person hiding and the other player's trying to beat them, or the scenario has been written by someone who you've never met and they can't control the mistakes you make or the leaps of logic you make. You ever done an escape room?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I like them.
A lot of escape rooms have a phone, right, where you missed a clue and you're stuck and you can't move forward, or you've read a clue backwards, you've missed a letter, and you're hammering against the wall. The phone rings and goes, "Guys, you read that wrong." There's a GM, basically, right?
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about, and that puts a lot of burden on one player, and that's why a lot of GMs burn out. But it allows people to sort of go. I think it shows what people want is like, I'd really like to play a bit of a tactical game and a bit of a storytelling game. But if it was just a tactical game, I'd feel like I might get crushed by someone who's smarter than me, or I won't make the right build, or something. And that can happen. You can make a game. You can start playing D&D, and someone will get the wrong assumption, and they'll make a really shit character, and they'll have no fun. But you can often go, okay, if you have a GM, you can sort of fix some of that a little bit. And yeah, but the GM is a way to make a tactical game a bit safer, and also to have a theatrical game that isn't just I'm on stage doing improv, because the GM can go, okay, well, that scene's over now. Some monsters attack or something. Whereas if you're in an acting scene, you might be like, oh, I'm having feels. So yeah, it's okay, and there's, I think, if you can make RPGs that you can want to win, and you can design them like that, and some element of that is always going to be in the DNA of RPGs. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sorry.
That, I was just thinking about is so I listened to one of the other talks earlier today.
Yeah.
That they were talking about the kind of the emotional elements of RPGs and the kind of get, or at least the desire to get certain emotional responses out of your players. And, again, referring back to board games, like I think about them in the same context of like being able to try to design an experience or a feeling of, being a particular type of thing, or, being in a particular type of world in a board game as well. How does that, when you think about designing an RPG, how much of that emotional narrative or kind of narrative arc, I guess, that's part of generating that emotional feeling. How do you either engineer that into the design of an RPG versus kind of relying on the GM to be the one that actually drives that narrative element and that emotional experience for the players? Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah, that does make sense. It is also kind of the $1 million question that lots of people have different opinions on. It sort of depends again on the kind of RPG and the kind of design that you do. And it also comes back to some of those things about how your game is written and how the setting is presented. So certain mechanics are more likely to produce certain kinds of emotional response. Like I was saying before, if your character sheet just has people's birthdays on it, you're more likely to get a scene where people have a surprise party, and that may be the kind of emotion you're looking for. Relics is designed to to make the players and the GM ask philosophical questions, and it keeps working in that regard. And I don't tell you to do it. I don't say this is what this game is for. And some games do that. Like I try to telegraph what kind of game it is, but it's also not. It's show don't tell. You're trying to sort of lead people into creating the sort of stories that create the emotions that you get. But there are other RPGs that are much more neutral. And some people prefer that. They're like, I want to be in control of those things. And it depends. So, or rather, a lot of RPGs are going, here's a menu of things you can do, and the GM will pick some. Like, so the Vampire RPG, the Vampire the Masquerade, has mechanics built into it where vampires are basically in a cycle of addiction. They cannot live without blood, but they are moral creatures who don't want to just kill people. So every time you build a character, you actually have to go, how does my character justify feeding? So you automatically, every story has to address that emotion. But a GM could take that, and a particularly levity-based group could go, yeah, but we want to play something. We want to have that element, but we're not going to put any attention on it. We're going to ignore that because we want to focus on intrigue. We go like, yes, we eat, but that's all off camera. And it's more about who's fighting who, right? Or it's actually, we just want to go out and fight other vampires, the bad vampires. So our game's all about combat and killing things. So a lot of RPGs are more kitchen sink in that regard, and either the group of players, but by the characters they make and the choices they make, change the tone, change the structure, change the focus, or the GM says, look, here's my idea. I want to make a game about vampires who all live on a boat and have to start fighting each other, right? That's a very different campaign, but you could use the same book for that. So it depends on the RPG. It depends on the design. And we did that with Relics as well. So Relics has a strong philosophical core to it, but we have a suggestion like, here's how to set up your campaign. You guys can all be hunting mystical items. You can all be Indiana Jones. You can all be Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? Here are these archetypes of the campaigns you can use. And so you can have very different flavors there. And a lot of the difference between mainstream and indie RPGs comes down to this, because a mainstream RPG, and again, it's just historical, it's changing. A mainstream RPG, by the fact that you want thousands of players, especially something like Dungeons & Dragons, essentially is often shies away from being too specific, because then you can only play one kind of campaign, right? You can't, if and that's part of D&D's strength to some extent, is it has a lot of buried assumptions which annoy me that they don't talk about, but it actually lets you have a fair scope of, like, you can play something that's more intrigue. You can all be rogues. You can all be barbarians. You can play very serious. You can play very light, because it doesn't really care as long as you're all fighting the monsters the same way. And
I think in other context, people would describe that as how opinionated a system, whether that's software or other context, like how opinionated is the thing. It's like, does it have very strong opinions and force you down a particular path?
Yeah.
Versus, it's very generic or essentially pushes a lot of decision making onto, I guess in this context, the GM to decide where they're going to focus or what additional infrastructure they're going to need to put in themselves to give the experience that they want.
Absolutely, yeah. And historically, mainstream games have been very less opinionated because it's like, you do whatever you want. We don't know you. We've given you a smorgasbord of options. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, the indie games sort of came in and went, no, we want you to play exactly this game, and it's going to be turned up to 11, and it's going to be only this, and you're going to walk away going, wow, I played a game where, that game was all about, like, there was a really big indie game that was like, every time you played it, you were all sailors, you were all on a ship, and someone had just murdered the captain, and it was like, and you're all pirates in the 18th century, and that was the only way to play that game. But it had mechanics really tailored so that every time you played, like, there were still ways to be different, but it was like, you knew exactly what you're getting. So indie games are often really, really opinionated, as you say. And what I try to do sometimes is try to change the vectors. So, and that's also quite popular, like these days, where the some of the elements are very opinionated, but others not. So, for example, Partners, right? You're always solving a mystery, but we have all these expansions to say, maybe it's this kind of mystery, maybe it's that kind of mystery, maybe it's a serial killer, maybe you're in the future, maybe it's cybernetics or something. So my friend's designing a game which is always about going on a journey. It has to begin at the start and always ends at the end of the journey. But you can go, right, you can just find every other element of it. You can say, we're in space, we're underground, we're in a car race across Paris in the 20s. So that's sort of opinionated on story structure, but not on setting.
So, I'm not sure if you remember this, but do you remember the old Choose Your Own Adventure books?
Yeah.
So obviously there's choices in there, but to a certain extent their choices are limited.
Yeah.
Where would that kind of fit in terms of how that compare, I guess, in terms of an RPG versus in terms of that level of opinionatedness?
So that sort of comes back to so in that case the book is sort of the GM in that sense, and it does often have very large ideas about where the story should go, and that allows it to control genre, but it also takes away a lot of agency to some extent. And I'm often frustrated by those books because it's like, well, you can often get screwed by choosing something that you think should be right, but isn't. So the system there is, in some ways, there's the idea of choosing options is quite neutral, and that's why there's so many different types of those books. But then the person who writes it and sets the tone becomes like the GM in that way, and they can have quite an opinion. Like I had one of the horror ones, and there were lots of ways where you would just get into a death trap, and no matter what you chose, you would suffer because it was horrible and cruel. But anyone could take a choose your own adventure system and make it all sorts of different things. So it depends. Yeah. So that I think is like the core system is very unopinionated, and then the person who writes the book has a lot of control. It's actually more like a GM in that sense, because they're like controlling the outcomes, controlling the tone, controlling how many monsters you fight, and things like that. They're actually making a board game out of the fighting fantasy novels. I have no idea if it's going to be good, but people like nostalgia. So that's.
Would this compare similarly as well to things like I was called Bandersnatch, the interactive thing.
Bandersnatch is basically just a choose your own adventure. Yeah,
I think they followed a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
I remember a lot of times one of the things that was really interesting was also to be able to see a bunch of people essentially mapped out all the decisions and all the different endings, and being able to see that was kind of an interesting exercise as well.
Yeah, and there is a sort of an equivalent of that where you have what we call the pre-written adventures in RPGs. So in the old days, the adventures were really just what we called maps. They even had you know the word maps. There's another word. They were basically dungeon floor maps.
I'm not sure if it's, but I would probably think of them as decision trees or story branchings.
Well, no, but before that, they weren't maps. They were actual maps. They were like dungeon templates. Like this is the room that you this building has 20 floors. Each floor has this floor map, and this is what is in every room. And then that was the adventure. And so it was effectively a decision tree. But you just look on your map and go, okay, you guys walked into room 23. That means there are 3 Gorgons. Next room, there is a potion. And then what happened was people went, well, that's kind of boring, and it's very. What if we had a thing was like, if you fight the Gorgon, then the wizard is impressed, and just decision trees appeared, and a lot of the art of writing these adventures or scenarios or whatever people call them is trying to allow for players to do anything, but also produce a coherent narrative. And just like Choose Your Own Adventures, there's a thing called railroading, which is where it feels like you have no agency. No matter what happens, you're going to be taken to the king. Oh, we don't want to get taken to the king. We're going to fight the guards. Well, there's 100 guards. You can't. Or we run away. Well, the king goes and finds you. We go to the next town. The king's there. That's called railroading. It's like you forcing people to go to certain things. But if you have no flow to story, the adventure can get very boring. And actually, most people don't like adventures because a lot of them are written that when you run them, you either feel really railroady or they're not written very well, because this is actually a very difficult problem to solve, to make a story that has branching and control and agency, but can be written down in 3,000 words and has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's really tough. And no one's can really solve that, but there are people who are better at it than others, and so on. That idea of scenario writing is what can be interesting about that is if you have a good one is you can do sort of the Bandersnatch thing where you go, like I used to love going to conventions and running the same adventure 8 different times and then just going and then discussing at the end going like, you guys knew who the bad guy was straight away, so I suddenly had to add this whole tunnel adventure where you chased them for an hour, or the next group is like, you were so confused. And a lot of my LARPs, I've done that as well. Like I've run some of my more complicated LARPs, and then I get to sit down and go, okay, so when you played that character, you were really intense, and that to me is, I think, it's really fascinating to sort of unpick, like the Bandersnatch thing is like, because in those cases with Bandersnatch, you're sort of trying to choose as the character, but it's sort of as a GM, you're also going, how do I give my players lots of tools to make interesting choices and then get to see what choices they make? That's the thrill of being a GM and an adventure writer or a LARP writer, is you get to go, this is sort of the position of everyone at the start, and then where are you going with that? You can have when we have live actions or free forms as they're called. You're often just, instead of writing a series of choices, you're writing a series of character backgrounds. So this character has this secret, but knows about character B. Character B knows character's F secret, but wants to kill character C. And then you just let them go, and how they spark creates the story. And in a sense, that's sort of what you're trying to do with a good adventure or a good system as well. To have a bunch of characters and a bunch of ideas, elements, monsters to fight, dice rolls, so that they bounce off it in a way that creates a story that nobody could have created on their own. And it's just every storytelling game and role-playing game. Oh, we've lost you. There we go.
Yeah, it's gotcha.
Did you drop out?
No, I'm still here.
Okay.
I'm still on the Discord at least.
Aha! Right. The count on the Twitch went down to 1, and I thought that was that it was just me. I don't know if it counts me or not.
I think it only counts me because when it was just me and you previously, it was still showing only 1. So I think that one streamer is me.
That's cool. All right. But yeah, every storytelling game I think is trying to, at least I think they should be, making ways for characters with ideas to bounce off each other in interesting ways and create a story, as I say, that you couldn't come up with on your own.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I approach the design puzzle. It's like, how do I give you enough so that it's easy, but not so much that you're telling the same story every time.
Yeah. Okay.
I might call it there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We've been going for an hour. We definitely had a few people pop on. I hope my questions were useful.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
Were fun, but also for other people to listen to. But thanks. It was fun just to talk about that stuff.
No worries, man. I'll hopefully see you on Tuesday.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Steve.
All right. See you, man. Bye. And thank you to all of you out there in recording land for jumping on the stream. And this, of course, will be on my YouTube. Like everything else, if you've got any questions about making RPGs, I know all the answers. Apparently, I'm old and I make RPGs way too fast. But I like a challenge. So come and ask me questions. Let's tear into what makes an RPG. And yeah, love to talk to you. Bye-bye.